The bells of Lisbon rang on the first day of November in the year 1755, calling the faithful to Mass across a city built on hills and faith. The morning arrived cool and bright, the kind of autumn day when the Tagus River caught the light just so, turning silver where the fishing boats cut through its surface. By 9:30, nearly every church in the city had filled with worshippers dressed in their finest clothes, come to honor the dead and pray for the souls in purgatory. The streets emptied as the congregation settled into pews, and the smell of incense drifted from open doors into cobblestone lanes, still damp from the previous night's rain. No one suspected that this holy day would become the day Lisbon died. If you find these historical tales worth your time, consider subscribing to support more stories from the quiet corners of the past. Now, let us return to that November morning when the city still stood whole. Father Miguel Carvalho stood at the altar of São Domingos Church in the Rocio district, conducting the High Mass with the precision of a man who had performed this ritual for 17 years. At 39, he had gray threading through his dark hair, and his voice carried to the back of the cathedral without strain. The church held perhaps 600 souls that morning, packed shoulder to shoulder in the pews and standing along the walls. Children fidgeted beside their mothers. Old women clutched rosaries. The chandeliers overhead, massive iron fixtures holding dozens of candles, swayed slightly in the draft that always moved through the high spaces of the building. Father Miguel had prepared his sermon carefully, choosing words about mortality and grace that felt appropriate for the feast day. He spoke of saints who had suffered, of the brevity of earthly life, of the need to prepare one's soul for judgment. The congregation listened with the half-attention of people who had heard similar words many times before. A baby cried somewhere in the middle pews. An old man coughed. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting colored patterns across the stone floor. At the harbor, João Santos had been awake since before dawn. At 44, he had spent 30 years fishing the waters off Lisbon, and he knew the rhythms of the sea the way other men knew prayers. His boat, the Santa Maria, lay at anchor about a quarter mile from shore, close enough to see the city rising in tiers from the waterfront, but far enough out that the motion of the waves felt clean and regular. His nets were already cast. 2 other fishermen worked on the boat with him, his cousin Paulo and a young man named Tomas, who was learning the trade. The morning had brought a good catch of sardines, and they were discussing where to sell them when they returned to shore. The water looked normal. The sky looked normal. João had no reason to think this day would be different from any other, except that it was a holy day, which meant the markets would be less crowded and the priests would be occupied. He planned to attend a later Mass after the fish were sold and cleaned. His wife Maria had already gone to church with their 3 daughters. He pictured them sitting in their usual pew at Santa Catarina, near the back where the draft was less cold. In the Baixa district, Rafael Mendes stood on the second-floor balcony of a building he had designed, looking out over the grid of streets that formed the commercial heart of Lisbon. At 36, he had established himself as one of the city's promising young architects, and this building, a merchant's residence with a shop on the ground floor, represented some of his finest work. The proportions pleased him. The stonework had been executed exactly as he had specified. The balcony railings, curved in an elegant pattern he had spent weeks perfecting. The street below was nearly empty, which was unusual for a weekday morning, but of course it was All Saints' Day. Most of the shops had closed, most of the people were in churches. Rafael himself planned to attend a later Mass, preferring to avoid the crowds of the early services. For now, he enjoyed the quiet and the opportunity to inspect his work without the usual noise of commerce and traffic. He noticed a small crack in the plaster near one of the upper windows and made a mental note to have it repaired. The building stood 4 stories tall, its foundation deep in the earth that had supported structures for centuries. Lisbon was an old city, built and rebuilt many times, and the ground beneath it held layers of Roman ruins, Moorish fortifications, medieval construction. Rafael knew that foundations mattered more than decoration, that a building's beauty meant nothing if it could not stand. He had designed this one to last for generations. André Silva walked his patrol route through the Alfama district, where the narrow streets wound uphill in a maze that confused visitors but felt like home to him. At 31, he had served in the city guard for 9 years, and he knew every alley, every hidden courtyard, every place where troublemakers might gather. The morning patrol on All Saints' Day was usually quiet. Most people were either in church or sleeping off the previous night's celebrations. He carried a musket slung over his shoulder and a sword at his belt, though he rarely needed either in this neighborhood. The houses here leaned close together, blocking out much of the sky. Laundry hung on lines stretched between windows. A cat watched him from a doorstep. An old woman sweeping her threshold nodded as he passed. André had grown up in these streets, knew the families who lived in most of these buildings. His own parents had attended early Mass at São Vicente de Fora and would be home by now, preparing the midday meal that would include half the extended family. He thought about stopping by their house after his shift ended, but he had promised to meet friends at a tavern near the river. They would drink wine and eat grilled fish and talk about nothing important: women they admired, horses they wished they could afford, rumors about military promotions, normal things, the kind of conversation that filled the spaces between work and sleep and made life feel solid and predictable. At 9:15, Father Miguel reached the part of his sermon where he discussed the nature of divine justice. He spoke about how God's ways were mysterious but ultimately benevolent, how suffering in this life prepared the soul for eternal joy. The words came easily, worn smooth by repetition. He had given versions of this sermon dozens of times. The chandeliers swayed slightly, which was not unusual. The church was old, and drafts moved through it constantly. Father Miguel continued speaking. He gestured toward the crucifix that hung above the altar, carved from dark wood and surrounded by gold leaf that caught the candlelight. The congregation shifted in their seats, uncomfortable from sitting still for so long, but patient with the familiar ritual. Out on the water, João Santos pulled in another net full of sardines. The fish were running well today, better than they had in weeks. He and Paulo worked efficiently, their movements synchronized by years of practice. Thomas struggled with his section of the net, and Paulo showed him the proper technique for gathering it without tangling the lines. The boat rocked gently. The sun climbed higher. The city spread along the shore like a painting, white buildings and red roofs rising toward the hilltop castles. Rafael Mendes left his balcony and walked through the empty rooms of the building, checking the floors and walls for any signs of settling or stress. Everything looked solid. The plaster was clean and white. The wooden beams that supported the upper floors showed no cracks or warping. He felt proud of this work, satisfied in the way a craftsman feels when he has built something that will outlast him. He thought about his next commission, a larger building near the palace, and considered what design elements might work best for that location. André Silva completed his patrol route and started back toward the guard station. The morning remained quiet, almost unnaturally so. Even the usual sounds of the city, cartwheels on cobblestones, vendors calling out their wares, children playing, were absent, muffled by the observance of the holy day. He passed São Jorge Castle, perched on its high hill, and looked down at the view of Lisbon spreading to the river. From this height, the city looked peaceful and permanent, as if it had always been here and always would be. In São Domingo's church, Father Miguel concluded his sermon and began the Eucharistic prayer. The congregation rose to their feet. The chandeliers swayed again, more noticeably this time. A few people glanced up, but no one seemed alarmed. Old buildings made sounds and movements. It was nothing unusual. At exactly 9:40 in the morning, the ground began to shake. Father Miguel's voice faltered mid-sentence. The chandeliers swung wildly, their candles flickering. The congregation froze, confusion spreading across their faces. For a moment, everyone stood still, waiting to see if the trembling would stop. It did not stop. The shaking grew stronger. A low rumble rose from deep in the earth, like distant thunder, but coming from below instead of above. The first screams started as cracks appeared in the cathedral walls. Chunks of plaster fell from the ceiling. One of the chandeliers tore loose from its mounting and crashed onto the pews below, crushing several people instantly. Father Miguel gripped the altar to keep his balance as the entire building began to sway. The stained glass windows shattered, sending colored shards across the congregation. People ran toward the doors, but the doorways were already crowded with bodies pushing and shoving in panic. The ceiling groaned. Stone supports that had held for centuries began to crack. Father Miguel looked up and saw the roof beginning to collapse. He tried to move, tried to run, but the floor buckled beneath his feet. The last thing he saw before the darkness came was a massive stone column breaking in half, its upper portion falling toward the altar where he stood. Then weight and pain and the sound of screaming muffled and distant as tons of stone and timber buried the congregation of São Domingo's church. The earthquake lasted between 3 and 6 minutes, though no one could agree afterward on the exact duration. Time stretched and compressed strangely when the ground refused to stay still. Father Miguel lay pinned beneath rubble, conscious but unable to move. A wooden beam pressed across his chest, not crushing him completely but holding him fast. He could hear voices around him, crying, praying, calling for help, but he could not see anything except darkness and a small sliver of gray light somewhere above. Dust filled his lungs. He tried to speak, to call out, but only managed a weak cough that sent pain radiating through his ribs. Around him, the cathedral had become a tomb. Of the 600 people who had been attending Mass, perhaps 200 were dead already, crushed by falling stone or impaled by broken timbers. The rest were trapped like Father Miguel, pinned under debris or blocked by collapsed walls. A few had made it to the doors before the roof fell, stumbling out into streets that were themselves choked with rubble from other collapsed buildings. The morning that had been so bright and peaceful now looked like a vision of hell, dust clouds rising over ruined structures, people wandering in shock, blood on the cobblestones. Out on the water, João Santos had felt the earthquake differently. The boat had lurched sideways, nearly capsizing, as waves radiated outward from some invisible center. Paulo had fallen and cracked his head on the gunwale, leaving him dazed and bleeding. Tomás had grabbed the mast to steady himself, his face white with terror. For several minutes, the water beneath them heaved and rolled in patterns that made no sense. Crossing waves, sudden drops, the boat rising and falling in sickening jerks. When the shaking finally stopped, João looked toward shore and felt his stomach turn to ice. The city's skyline had changed. Buildings that had stood for hundreds of years were simply gone, replaced by clouds of dust. He could see fires starting in several locations, small orange glows that would soon spread. But what terrified him most was what happened to the water itself. The sea began to retreat. João had fished these waters his entire life, had seen low tides and high tides and every variation between, but he had never seen anything like this. The water pulled back from the shore as if some giant hand had reached down and dragged it toward the horizon. The harbor floor emerged, mud and rocks and the hulls of sunken ships from decades past. Fish flopped on the exposed seabed. The Santa Maria settled downward as the water level dropped, tilting sideways. "Row!" João shouted at his companions. "Row for deep water! Now!" Paulo, still bleeding from his head wound, looked at him in confusion. "What? Why?" "The water's coming back," João said, his voice tight with certainty. He had heard stories from old fishermen, tales passed down from grandfathers, about earthquakes that pulled the sea away before sending it back in a wave, tall as a church steeple. He had always thought they were just stories. When it comes back, it will come back all at once. We need to be in deep water or we're dead. They rowed. Paulo and Tomás pulled the oars while João steered, guiding them away from shore, away from the harbor where dozens of other boats sat grounded on the exposed seabed. He shouted warnings to other fishermen, but most of them were staring at the city, transfixed by the destruction, not paying attention to the water. Some had even started rowing toward shore, thinking to help with rescue efforts or check on their families. The water continued to retreat. The harbor became a vast mudflat. People who had fled the earthquake gathered at the waterfront, thinking it safer than the collapsing buildings. João could see them from his boat. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, clustering on the docks in the wide plaza that fronted the river. They stood in groups, some crying, some praying, some simply standing in shock. They had no idea what was coming. João rowed harder. The Santa Maria moved slowly, scraping occasionally against submerged obstacles. The water was barely 3 feet deep now in places where it should have been 20. Behind him, he heard Tomás praying in a whisper. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." Then he saw it. Far out, near the horizon, a dark line appeared across the water. At first, it looked like a shadow or a cloud, but it moved wrong. It moved toward them, growing taller as it came. João's hands went numb on the oars. The wave was massive, higher than any building he had ever seen, a moving wall of water that blocked out the sky. In the Baixo district, Rafael Mendes had survived the earthquake by pure chance. He had been standing in a doorway when the shaking started, and the doorframe had held even as the walls around it crumbled. The building he had designed, the one he had been so proud of, had collapsed completely. 4 stories, reduced to a pile of broken stone and splintered wood. If he had been on the upper floor or the balcony, he would be dead. He stumbled into the street, coughing dust from his lungs. Around him, the commercial district lay in ruins. Buildings that had stood for centuries were gone. The careful grid of streets he had admired that morning was now an obstacle course of rubble and cracked pavement. Bodies lay visible in some places, partially buried. Injured people called for help from beneath collapsed walls. A woman sat on the curb holding a dead child, rocking back and forth, making no sound. Rafael walked without direction, unable to process what he was seeing. His mind kept trying to understand how it had happened, what structural weakness, what flaw in the foundations, what failure of engineering. But there was no single flaw. The earthquake had been too strong. No building in Lisbon had been designed to withstand forces like that. His training, his careful calculations, his years of study, none of it had mattered. He found himself walking toward the river, following the crowds of people who fled the inland districts. The waterfront seemed safer, away from the tall buildings that might still collapse. He passed São Paulo Church and saw that its facade had sheared off completely, the interior exposed like a dollhouse. Altars and pews visible 3 stories up, bodies hanging from broken floors. André Silva had been thrown to the ground when the earthquake struck. His patrol route had taken him through a narrow alley in Alfama, and the buildings on either side had leaned inward, nearly touching overhead. For several terrifying seconds, he thought they would collapse and crush him, but they held. When the shaking stopped, he got to his feet and began running toward the main square, thinking to help with rescue efforts. The old district had suffered less damage than other parts of the city. The buildings here were shorter, built on bedrock, and many of them had survived. But fires had started. Candles from All Saints' Day observances had been knocked over, and flames now licked from windows and doorways. André organized bucket brigades, directing civilians to form lines from the public fountains to the burning buildings. But the fountains weren't working. The underground pipes had broken during the earthquake, and no water came from the taps. People looted shops with broken windows. André tried to stop them, shouting orders and threats, but he was one man and they were dozens. Someone grabbed a bolt of silk cloth. Someone else carried away a sack of flour. A merchant who tried to protect his stock was beaten unconscious. André drew his sword, prepared to arrest the looters, but more people appeared. People whose homes had collapsed, who had lost everything, who saw abandoned goods and took them, because what else could they do? He lowered his sword. The city was dying, and he was trying to enforce laws that no longer seemed to matter. He left the looters and headed toward the river, following the same instinct that drew thousands of others: get away from the buildings, get to open space, wait for the shaking to stop, and then decide what to do next. The wave hit Lisbon at approximately 10:15 in the morning. João Santos and his crew were far enough out that the tsunami passed beneath their boat as a massive swell, lifting them 40 feet in the air and then setting them down again as it raced toward shore. From their elevated position, they saw what happened next. The wave struck the waterfront with a sound like continuous thunder. It swept over the docks and plazas where thousands of survivors had gathered, swallowing them instantly. Buildings that had survived the earthquake were smashed flat by the force of the water. Boats that had been grounded on the exposed harbor floor were picked up and hurled inland, crashing through structures hundreds of yards from shore. The wave penetrated more than a quarter mile into the city, flooding streets and squares and churches with black water full of debris and bodies. João watched people disappear. One moment they were standing on the plaza, the next they were gone, swept away like leaves in a stream. The wave receded, pulling back toward the sea, and then came again, a second surge, smaller than the first but still devastating. Then a third. Each wave carried more debris, more destruction, more death. Rafael Mendes had reached the waterfront minutes before the wave arrived. He stood on the Terreiro do Paço, the great plaza in front of the royal palace, surrounded by other survivors. Someone next to him pointed at the retreating water and said something about it being a miracle. Rafael looked out at the exposed harbor floor and felt a deep wrongness in his gut. Water didn't behave like that. Something terrible was coming. He started to run back toward higher ground, but he had only taken a few steps when he heard the roar. He turned and saw the wave bearing down on him, a wall of water higher than the palace itself, dark and filled with broken ships and timber and stone. There was nowhere to run. The wave was too fast, too big. Rafael closed his eyes and prayed the prayer he had learned as a child, "Our Father, who art in heaven." And then the water hit him, and the world became chaos and drowning and the taste of salt. Rafael Mendes woke up in darkness, cold water lapping at his face. He lay on his stomach, draped over something hard and wooden, debris from a boat, he realized, a broken section of hull. His body ached everywhere. His mouth tasted of salt and blood. For several minutes he simply breathed, grateful to be breathing at all, unable to process how he had survived. When he finally lifted his head, he saw that the wave had deposited him nearly 3 streets inland from where he had been standing. The plaza was unrecognizable. Where the royal palace had stood, only the lower walls remained, the upper floors sheared away. Bodies lay everywhere, in the mud, tangled in wreckage, floating face down in pools of standing water. A horse wandered past, limping, its eyes wide with terror. Rafael tried to stand and found that his left leg wouldn't support his weight properly. Something damaged in the knee, maybe broken. He used a length of timber as a crutch and began limping back toward higher ground. The fires had spread. What had started as scattered blazes from overturned candles had merged into a conflagration that consumed entire districts. The earthquake had broken the water mains, so there was no way to fight the flames. People simply fled before them, abandoning the injured and the trapped. Rafael could feel the heat from blocks away, could smell burning wood and cloth, and worse things he tried not to identify. Father Miguel had been trapped under rubble for nearly 3 hours when he heard voices above him. Rescuers were digging through the ruins of São Domingos church, searching for survivors. He tried to call out, but his voice emerged as barely a whisper. His throat was raw from dust and thirst. The wooden beam across his chest pressed down with relentless weight, making each breath a conscious effort. He heard footsteps, voices conferring, the sound of stones being moved, then silence. The rescuers had moved to another section of the ruins. Father Miguel felt tears running down his face, cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He had spent 17 years telling people about God's mercy, about divine providence, about how suffering had meaning. Now, trapped in darkness with dead parishioners all around him, those words felt hollow. If God was merciful, why had the ground shaken during Mass? Why had the cathedral roof collapsed on worshippers who had come to honor the saints? He thought about the people he had seen die. The old woman in the front pew who always arrived early to pray the rosary. The young family with 4 children, the merchant who donated generously to the church's charitable works. All of them crushed, their faith providing no protection. The chandelier that fell had killed a dozen people instantly. The stone column that pinned Father Miguel had crushed the altar boy standing next to him, a child of 12 whose name was Antonio. Father Miguel could see Antonio's hand, small and pale, visible in a shaft of light a few feet away. The hand did not move. André Silva had avoided the tsunami by minutes. His route from Alfama had taken him through streets that climbed uphill, and he had been 50 feet above sea level when the wave struck. He watched from a high vantage point as the water consumed the lower city, and then he ran toward the waterfront to help with rescue efforts. What he found when he got there was beyond his ability to comprehend. The dead numbered in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. They lay in heaps where the water had deposited them, tangled with wreckage, many of them stripped naked by the force of the waves. Some were still alive, calling weakly for help, but there were too many to save. André and other soldiers tried to organize rescue parties, but the fires were spreading and they had to keep moving, abandoning the injured to save themselves from burning. Looters appeared again, more brazen now. They stripped bodies of jewelry and clothing. They broke into damaged buildings and carried away whatever had value. André confronted a group of men dragging a chest from a ruined merchant's house, and one of them pulled a knife. André shot him with his musket. The man fell, blood spreading across his shirt, and the others scattered. André reloaded mechanically, his hands shaking. He had killed a man for stealing a chest of goods. In the old city, the city that had existed that morning, it would have been justice. Now it felt meaningless. The fires kept spreading. The wind had picked up, carrying embers from burning districts to areas that had survived the earthquake and tsunami. André watched flames consume the Ribera Palace, the royal library with its thousands of books, the opera house, churches and convents and hospitals. The heat grew so intense that people couldn't approach within 2 blocks of some conflagrations. They could only watch as the city burned. João Santos and his crew stayed on the water for the rest of the day, not daring to return to shore. From their boat, they witnessed the destruction of Lisbon across 6 hours, the earthquake at 9:40, the tsunami at 10:15, the fires that burned through the afternoon and into the night. The city glowed orange against the darkening sky, smoke rising in pillars that could be seen for miles. "My family," Paulo said at one point, staring toward shore. His head wound had stopped bleeding, but he looked pale and sick. Maria and the girls, they were at Santa Catarina Church. João said nothing. Santa Catarina Church stood in the Bairro Alto, in the direct path of the fires. Even if his family had survived the earthquake, they would have been caught by the flames. But he couldn't tell Paulo that, couldn't take away hope, even when hope was irrational. They saw other boats on the water, fishing vessels like their own, merchant ships that had been anchored in the harbor, even a few naval frigates. Some of them tried to approach the shore to help with evacuations, but the fires made it nearly impossible. The heat drove them back. The smoke choked anyone who got too close. By late afternoon, most boats had given up and simply waited, watching the city die. Tomás prayed continuously, his voice a low murmur that blended with the sounds of wind and water. João didn't tell him to stop. Prayer was as useful as anything else at this point, more useful than rowing, certainly, more useful than watching and being unable to help. Rafael Mendes found shelter in a half-collapsed building in the Chiado district as night fell. The fires hadn't reached this area yet, but they were coming. He could see the glow to the south and east, could hear the roar and crack of the burning structures. His injured leg had swollen grotesquely, and he had developed a fever. He lay on the floor of what had been a shop, surrounded by other survivors, maybe 20 people, all injured or sick, all too weak to run anymore. No one spoke much. They had shared their stories earlier, who they had lost, how they had survived, what they had seen. Now they simply waited, each person alone with their thoughts. A woman nursed a baby that wouldn't stop crying. A man with a broken arm kept trying to set it himself, gasping in pain. An elderly couple held hands, their faces blank with shock. Rafael thought about the buildings he had designed, all of them gone, he assumed. His life's work reduced to rubble in 6 minutes of shaking. He had studied at the finest schools, had apprenticed under masters, had learned the principles of proportion and structure and beauty. He had believed that architecture was a kind of permanence, that a well-designed building could outlast its creator, could stand for centuries. The earthquake had revealed that belief as arrogant foolishness. He dozed fitfully, waking every time his leg throbbed or someone nearby cried out. In one of these half-waking moments, he heard the fire coming closer. The roar had grown louder, and the orange glow visible through the broken windows had brightened. People began to stir, to gather their few possessions, to prepare to run again. Rafael tried to stand and fell. His leg wouldn't hold him. The fever had gotten worse. He could feel heat radiating from his skin. "Leave me," he told the others. "I can't walk. Save yourselves." Some of them left immediately, stumbling into the smoke-filled street. Others hesitated, looking at Rafael and the handful of other injured who couldn't move. A young man, maybe 20 years old, with burn marks on his arms, finally made the decision. "We carry them," he said. "We don't leave anyone." Father Miguel was finally pulled from the rubble of São Domingo's church 36 hours after the earthquake. By then, he had lost all sense of time. He had drifted in and out of consciousness, had hallucinated conversations with dead parishioners, had prayed and cursed and wept and gone silent. When hands finally reached him and pulled away the beam that had pinned him, he couldn't believe it was real. They carried him to a makeshift hospital in a park that had become a refugee camp. Thousands of survivors lived there now, sleeping on the ground, cooking over small fires, tending to their injured. There was no medicine, no clean water, no bandages except torn clothing. People died from infections, from dehydration, from injuries that would have been survivable in the city that had existed 3 days ago. Father Miguel's ribs were broken, and his back had been damaged in ways that would never fully heal. But he was alive. He didn't feel grateful. He felt hollow. A doctor, a barber actually, pressed into medical service, told him he was lucky. Father Miguel said nothing. Lucky would have been being somewhere else that morning. Lucky would have been the earthquake striking at night when the churches were empty. Lucky would have been God preventing this at all. The fires burned for 6 days. When they finally died down, nearly 85% of Lisbon had been destroyed. The death toll would never be precisely known. Estimates ranged from 40,000 to 70,000 people. King Jose I had survived, having been outside the city when the earthquake struck, but the royal family would never live in Lisbon again. The king developed a phobia of enclosed spaces and spent the rest of his life in a complex of tents. João Santos eventually returned to shore and found his house collapsed. He searched for 2 days before finding the bodies of his wife and daughters in the ruins of Santa Catarina Church. He buried them in a mass grave with hundreds of others. Paulo's family was never found, presumed drowned in the tsunami. Tomás left Lisbon and never returned to the sea. André Silva continued his duties as a guard in a city that barely existed anymore. He helped maintain order in the refugee camps, distributed what little food could be found, shot looters when he had to. He drank heavily in the evenings, trying to forget the things he had seen, but the memories never faded. The sound of buildings collapsing, the screams of the drowning, the smell of burning flesh. Rafael Mendes survived his fever and his injured leg, though he walked with a permanent limp afterward. He never designed another building. He spent his remaining years drinking in taverns, telling anyone who would listen about the architecture of the old city, the beautiful buildings that no one would ever see again. He died 7 years later, falling drunk into the Tagus River and drowning in 3 feet of water. Father Miguel lived for another 30 years, but he never conducted Mass again. He lost his faith somewhere under the rubble of São Domingos Church, buried alongside Antonio and the old woman with the rosary and the family with 4 children. He worked in the refugee camps for several years, helping rebuild, but he did it as simple labor, not as a priest. When people asked him about God's will or divine purpose, he had no answer. The morning of November 1st had taught him that earthquakes had no meaning, no message, no moral. Sometimes the ground simply shook. Sometimes cities fell. Sometimes 600 people went to church and never came home. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 marked a turning point in European thought. Philosophers and theologians struggled to explain how a benevolent God could allow such suffering. Voltaire wrote Candide partly in response to the disaster, mocking the idea that this was the best of all possible worlds. The Enlightenment gained momentum, powered partly by questions that had no comfortable answers. The city was eventually rebuilt, using new engineering techniques and grid-patterned streets designed to better withstand future earthquakes. But the Lisbon that rose from the ashes was not the same city that had stood that All Saints' Day morning. That city, with its narrow medieval streets and towering churches and absolute faith, was gone forever.